Okay, Rhonda.
Good afternoon, everyone. We know that we see the numbers climbing there with our participants, so we're going to give a little bit of time to let everyone in the chat, but good afternoon, actually. It's morning somewhere else in the world, but not here. And so we're up to about 42. We had close to 150 that actually registered, so we'll give a few more minutes to allow folks to come into this webinar on this beautiful spring day. And I'll give another couple of minutes to have people join us. So appreciate your patience. Okay, we're probably a third of the way there. I'll give another minute to get some more folks in, and then I will get us started. Just want to honor and respect everyone's time. And for those who started on time, we're going to honor that. So welcome everyone as you're coming into our webinar. Happy to have you. Okay, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Rhonda Anderson, and I have the honor of serving as president and CEO of the YMCA of Greensboro. We are delighted that you chose to join us today. But before we get started with our 846 webinar, I invite you to join me for a moment of prayer on this National Day of Prayer. Regardless of your belief system, I hope that you will agree that we are stronger together and that prayer is a channel that can serve to unify. If you don't believe in the power of prayer, I ask that you pause for a moment of reflection. Let us pray. Most gracious and eternal God, thank you for this day, for the opportunity to connect with our brothers and sisters who are earnestly seeking ways of creating a more equitable and just community. I pray your blessings upon each and every household that's on this webinar, that you will bless them with your love, grace, mercy, and abundance. I pray for unity in our nation, our communities, and our families, that we would examine our hearts and actions before examining the same of our brothers and sisters. I pray for justice where there has been an injustice. I pray for peace where there is strife. I pray for hope where there is hopelessness. I pray for prosperity where there is lack. I pray for strength when we are weak. I pray for empathy and compassion where there is coldness of heart. I pray that you give us the courage to do what is right in your eyes. I pray for truth to prevail. I pray that you would touch the hearts, minds, and will of those who have power and authority to impact the lives of many, that they may have a desire to serve the people and not pursue their own self-interest. Finally, please empower us with the perseverance we need to continue working to improve our communities. Sometimes it seems we're taking one step forward and two steps back. Strengthen our fortitude and resolve to keep pressing on, no matter what the obstacles and challenges may be. May we be steadfast and unwavering in our prayers for our families, our communities, and our nation. Encourage us as we pray by showing us ways our work is bearing fruit. We thank you for your strength, and it is in your name we pray. Amen. Thank you. And now I turn this over to Lynn Harvey-Khan, who will bring greetings and thank our sponsors. Lynn?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Rhonda. On behalf of NCCJ of the Piedmont Triad and the YMCA of Greensboro, thank you for choosing to spend this time with us today. My name is Lynn Harvey-Khan, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair-elect for the YMCA of Greensboro and the chair of the Y's Diversity, Inclusion, and Global Engagement Committee. The 846 series originally launched in August of 2020, educating over 900 community members on systemic racism and its impact on our society. We should note, in 2020, we named the series for the 8 minutes and 46 seconds Officer Chauvin's knee was on George Floyd's neck. Now, we have since learned that his knee on George Floyd's neck was for well over 9 minutes. For 2021, our Beyond the 846 series webinars explore diverse racial equity journeys, personal growth strategies, vulnerabilities, and ways to work together. We are able to offer these webinars free of charge because of the generous support from these sponsors. Our change agent sponsors, Liberty Hardware, S.J. Edwards Foundation, and United Healthcare. Empowering sponsors, Contour Brands, American National Bank and Trust, Cone Health Foundation, First Bank, the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro, BB&T, now Truist, Triad Adult Pediatric Medicine, the Women's Professional Forum Foundation, and the Weaver Foundation. Thank you to our sponsors. Today's presentation, The Story of Race, How We Got Here, and What We Can Do Now, will be presented in 2 parts. In part 1, Curtis Chesney, author of Roots of Division, Uncovering What Lies Beneath America's Racial Divide, provides historical context, the How We Got Here part. For part 2, joining Curtis for an interactive discussion with Q&A are Winston McGregor, President of the Guilford Education Alliance and Vice Chair of the Guilford County Board of Education, and Sam Cohn, Financial Consultant with Pisker Wealth and dedicated advocate. More detailed bios of each speaker may be found in the chat. Please do use the chat and Q&A features during this webinar with your comments and questions. Now, to speak to the elephant in the room. We have received questions regarding why today's webinar panelists are all white. This is and was intentional. We, the Beyond the 846 series team, recognize that dismantling white supremacy and systemic racism is not solely the charge of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. Clearly, white supremacy and systemic racism won't die until our white brothers and sisters see it as a white issue that needs solving rather than a Black issue to empathize with. To this end, our speakers have agreed to share some of their personal journeys of moving past empathy into action with us. This is the What We Can Do Now portion. So, without further ado, let us first begin with historical context and Curtis Chesney. Curtis?
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be invited. I will say that Zoom is not my favorite format. I would love to be in a big room, shoulder to shoulder, and I know that that's not the reality of where we are today. We just had a quick pre-call with the other panelists, and we were talking about that, just kind of where we are. I've had the experience some over the last year of often just feeling trapped behind a screen. I don't know if you felt like that. Let me share with you what has really been the defining memory for me of the last year. So this is my family. That's me at the bottom, my wife up top, and my 4 kids. And this is actually what we sent out as a Christmas card this year. But we are a family of extroverts who have felt like that for much of the last year and a half. So all that to say, look forward to a day hopefully coming soon when we can do session like this, shoulder to shoulder in a big room. My plan for our time here, we called it The Story of Race. And initially I was thinking I would really just race through a few hundred years of history in chronological order and tell what I would call the story of race to kind of catch us up to how we got to where we are now. That's hard to do in any good way in 30 minutes. And so I decided to shift gears a little bit and opted for a different approach. We'll still be diving into history, but in my 30-minute segment, what we'll do with that time is I just want to share with you 6 things that I have learned in my own journey and in my own research. So let me go ahead and tell you what those are now. And then what I'm going to do is go through them one at a time and flesh them out a little bit. So the first 2 are around the concept of whiteness, so the notion of being white. One is that white over the long haul, white was supreme and white was constant. I'll explain more about what I mean by each of those here in a few minutes. After that, we'll talk about history as a whole and how messy it is. And it's perhaps in its messiest form when you start to see how it impacts you and your family personally. So history is messy and personal. And then we'll close with a heavy dose of data for those who like data, and talking about how I would say that we have both come so far and have so far to go. Or to say that differently, we've accomplished so much and yet we've fallen so short. So that's a big arc of our time, and let's dive in. So to lead off, white was supreme. And I, of course, realized that when you attach the word supreme or supremacy to the word white, it is a lightning rod. But the notion of white as supreme just screams out through American history in so many ways. And slavery is just one of those ways, but it's a big one. To give you an idea of the magnitude, there were about 12 million captives taken from African shores and brought to American shores on 30,000 separate voyages. And the conditions on those voyages were so harsh that 10 to 20% of those people died at sea. The majority of those that survived were delivered into captivity in Central and South America. About 400,000 were delivered into slavery in the US, and that 400,000 would grow. We'll talk about that here in a bit. And there were certainly always moral debates about slavery, even at that time. And I would say that white leaders were aware of the evil and lived with and tried to rationalize that guilt. Why do I say that? I ran across a few years ago, it was the first time I'd ever run across the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. And in that original draft, hold up, let me pull it up here. Thomas Jefferson wrote, and he's speaking of the King of Great Britain. And he says, he, the king, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian, note the sarcasm, Christian King of Great Britain. So I read that as an attempt to shift blame. The blame for this evil, which is a clear evil, and we recognize is squarely on the backs of the King of Great Britain. And here, as we launch this new nation, we will be turning a leaf. Of course, we all know as the US began, it did not turn away from slavery. So what I show here with Thomas Jefferson's picture is a very well-known paragraph from the final Declaration of Independence. I've added the words white in caveats in brackets here because I believe that's how it really more accurately read at the time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all white men are created equal, that they are endowed by their white creator with certain unalienable white rights. For instance, at that time, there were no immigration rules. Really, anybody could come, but you could only become a citizen as an immigrant if you were accepted as white. That was true in the 1700s and all of the 1800s and up into the 1900s. You could only become a citizen if you were white. As for slavery, it was hotly debated, but though it was hotly debated, it was also accepted, widely accepted as status quo. Our most respected leaders, 10 of the first 12 presidents were enslavers, most of them enslaving people while holding office, while living in the White House. With few exceptions, if you just look at our population as a whole, this is the first census ever, which was in 1790. With few exceptions, our population was either white or enslaved. So you can see in white here, the white slice, 81% of all residents of our country were white and free, 18% were enslaved, and this last sliver here, the 1.5%, they were other and free. And other was literally the term in the census. So at the time, you were either called white or you were called other. And from that point, slavery grew and grew and grew. You might know that slavery, participation in international slave trade, I should say, was outlawed in the early 1800s in 1808. But there was a tragic irony there. By some sort of logic, it was decided that slavery was too evil to inflict on new captives and yet too necessary to free existing captives. And not only were people's bodies and all of themselves enslaved, but their wombs were enslaved, which means that even after you put an outlaw on bringing in new captives, slavery could still grow. In fact, it grew, the count of enslaved people grew by more than 20% every single decade without exception, leading all the way up into the Civil War. So by the time you got to 1860, there were about 4 million people enslaved in the US. And I think it's notable to realize that those 4 million people, they were not African captives. You could actually say they were American captives. 99% of them were US born, had never stepped foot in Africa. They were American captives on American soil, 4 million people. As we all know, the outcome of the Civil War brought freedom to those 4 million people, but what was that a freedom into? They still were to live in a land where white was supreme. What I'm showing here is the official poster, the official campaign motto for one of the two leading candidates in the 1968 presidential election. So again, this is after the Civil War. And this candidate, Seymour, he actually didn't win, but it was close. He won, I believe it was 47% of the popular vote, with the motto, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." So that gives you an idea of the ideological reality of the time, even after the Civil War. As for the financial reality, this captures it to me. So this is the 1870 census, first one taken after the Civil War. And of course, there was no sort of redistribution of wealth after the Civil War. And so what you had was 99+% of wealth was in white hands, less than 1% was in black hands. And if you just think about it, I mean, it's kind of like America was a game of Monopoly, I would say, where white people had circled the board and bought up the properties, established the rents, collected wealth before black players were given their first roll of the dice. So when you combine that financial reality with this ideological reality and these intense racial biases, it would be a long journey forward for any minority group, that is, any group that was not accepted as white, a generations long journey forward. So number one was white was supreme. Here, number two, white was constant. And I have just one visual that I'll use to explain this, but it was a really eye-opening one for me. This is labels of race in the census over time. So what you see here in the left column are years of the census, and what you see in the right column are the labels. These would be indicators of European ancestry. And what you can see here is that white is constant. It started white, it's still white. And you might say, well, you know, Curtis, that's not all that insightful. You know, that's just kind of how it works. You know, if you have a people group, they come together, they form a new identity, pick a name for it, and then you stick with it. Let's compare that to indicators of African ancestry in the census over time. Wildly different picture. Wildly different picture. As I mentioned before, at the outset in the first ever census, you were either white or you were other. There was no other label there. Soon after that, by 1820, colored was added to the census. A couple decades later, colored is removed and in comes black and mulatto. Mulatto indicating somebody who was not full, not 100% African ancestry, but mixed somehow. And there were instruction booklets for what were called census enumerators. They would go around and they would actually kind of interview people, and they decided everyone's race. And these instruction booklets from the federal government would tell them exactly how to decide who fit into what group. So a few decades later, even if you get down to 1890 here, there's two more categories added, quadroon and octoroon. And the enumerators were told if somebody has, they called it black blood. There's no such thing as black blood, but that's what they called it in these booklets. If somebody has 1/8 black blood, then you are to label them as octoroon, 1/4 quadroon, 1/2 mulatto, and full would be black. And this was all during an era of rise in eugenics. Eugenics is, in its basic form, pardon me for oversimplifying, but it's really basically human breeding. It's kind of a competition between nation states to breed your best population. And there were, of course, all kinds of racial undertones to that caused racial biases to really entrench from the late 1800s through the early 1900s. So the early 1900s is where we have the height of the Jim Crow era. And then you come into the civil rights era where Negro, hits the census and stays in the census. Actually, Negro was in the census all the way until 2010. There were some surveys done by the census to see if that terminology was still preferred or it was time to remove it. It was removed for the first time ever here in this most recent census in 2020. So white is constant over time, and that has not been the experience for anyone else. Excuse me. Moving on to these next two sections, just about history in general, I would say history is messy. Messy in a lot of ways. The main point that I want to make here, though, is that there are some eras and some people that we celebrate, and we celebrate them and remember them in a very sanitized way. I would argue that we often approach history kind of like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, where somebody gives it to us, we take it, we lick the jelly side and we give the rest back. We say we don't have appetite for the whole truth. Just give me the sweet side. So what do I mean when I say that? Let me give you a for instance. Europeans arriving in America, we want to lick the sweet side. We want to remember and talk about their courage and indeed to hop on a rudimentary ship and sail the Atlantic takes huge courage. We want to talk about their ability to unite, coming from different European countries and uniting across language and culture over time. We want to talk about their ingenuity in designing this system of democratic government with checks and balances, et cetera. We want the jelly side, but then we want to be done with it. We want to give it back. What we don't want to talk about is the calamity of epic proportions that came with the Europeans to the Americas. Because the Americas, and when I say that, I'm meaning North and South, all of the Americas, was not the unsettled frontier that's often portrayed or imagined. There were about 50 million people here, and that population of 50 million would decline by about 70% over the next century or two. I mean, it's just a stomach turning sort of calamity for the people that were here. Just to give you an idea of the attitudes that drove some of that. And I should say that much of that decline in population was European germs that were brought, germs that original inhabitants of the Americas were not accustomed to. But it was not just European germs, it was European guns, and it was European attitudes of white first. This is a quote from Andrew Jackson as President of the United States, saying that those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. They have neither the intelligence, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement, which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race and without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear. As I read this quote and a couple others that I'll read here in a minute, I mean, I feel like I need to apologize for even reading it. And yet I'm reading the words of some of our national heroes, of presidents of the nation. I mean, it's just really jaw-dropping. Bottom line is gains for the US. Bottom line realization for me, kind of light bulb moment, is that gains for the US were losses for other nations. Another example of that, what you see here, these are national borders as of around the 1830s. In dark gray, that is the United States of America. That's us. In white, what might surprise you to see it so large is Mexico. Of course, about half of that territory in white is now part of the United States. How did that happen? Well, it's a long story with a Texas twist, but the short version is we invaded deep into Mexico, to their capital city, and essentially forced the signing of a treaty with a nominal payment, and more importantly, an agreement to end that war in exchange for half of their territory. At the time, there was a senator from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln. He said that the war was unnecessarily and unconstitutionally commenced. And he went on to say this: "I shall be fully convinced of what I more than suspect already, that he being President James Polk, is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he feels the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying to heaven against him." Strong words. Nevertheless, half of Mexico became part of the US, and that's our Southwest today. Before I leave Abraham Lincoln, just my last point on history being messy. I have a quote that I want to read, and I'll forewarn you, it's an awful one. It's a direct quote from Abraham Lincoln, though. And Lincoln, as we all know, was unapologetically anti-slavery. I would even argue it was that stance of his that ultimately cost him his life. He paid the ultimate sacrifice. But though Lincoln was anti-slavery, he was not for equality, not for racial equality, not even close. Here is a rather long quote that I will read in full. In 1858, Lincoln said, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there's a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Harsh words. Our history is very messy. It's perhaps in its messiest form when we realize how personal it is. History is real people. History is us. History is our families. And the past connects to the present in continuous lines. The best way that I know to convey that is to share with you a little bit about my own family. So let me introduce you to these two people who you see on the left. This is John Chesney. He was my great-great-great-grandfather, lived in East Tennessee, where his continuous line straight through me lived around Knoxville, Tennessee. John did well for himself. He had a good deal of land. He had animals. He grew produce. Life was full, life was busy, and apparently he needed help. He made the same awful decision and self-serving decision that many others made, and he turned to slavery. The man on the right here, Pharaoh, at this time, so in the mid-1800s, early to mid-1800s, was living in Virginia. That's where he was born and had lived all his life with his wife and with his family until in 1841, John paid $421 for Pharaoh. And that took Pharaoh away from his family. He'd never see them again as he was moved from Virginia to Tennessee. Many years later, Pharaoh would recall that day saying this: "The saddest day in all my life came to me when I was told that my beloved wife and children must be taken one way and that I must go another." A more cruel blow could not have been given to me. I could not have felt worse if I had been told that we were all to be killed. It seemed almost to break my poor wife's heart, and the sad thought has always been with me whether the poor creature ever lived after our separation. Our 4 children were grown, and one of them married a man by the name of Jones, who were both sold and taken to Lexington, Kentucky. Of the other 3, I've never seen nor heard of since we were separated. And it's just tragic to think about. For the next 2 decades, Pharaoh would be forced to labor on the Chesney farm, on my ancestors' farm, my family's farm. And, you know, that's 150 years ago, but legacies of injustice live long. One way you can see that is in our very names. So after the Civil War, as one of first acts of freedom, newly freed people, many were able to choose their last name, and some people chose entirely new names. Some preferred the familiar. Pharaoh fit into that latter category, so he kept the name Chesney, which means he passed that to his descendants and on and on. So today, there are, in East Tennessee, there are white Chesneys as descendants of John, and there are black Chesneys as descendants of Pharaoh. And I did a lot of work kind of researching that family history and trying to follow the line, follow the family trees, and talking with some of Pharaoh's living descendants today to really try to understand how the past connects to the present. And in short form, what I would say is that not only was Pharaoh enslaved on account of his race, but for another 100+ years, his descendants were legally disadvantaged because of their race. And so if you look today and comparing descendants of Pharaoh and descendants of John, you'd see that on average, not to the individual, but on average, descendants of Pharaoh have, as families, less educational capital built up, less financial standing built up. And that's a statement about the present. It's a statement about the past too. They connect very directly. History is messy and history is personal. Of my 6 learnings, I have 2 more that I want to run through here in my last about 7 minutes that I have before I hand the baton over. And these 2, they sound different, and yet I think they're both true at the same time. I feel like sometimes we focus on one or the other, and it's hard to hold them both together. One is the idea that we've come so far, we've accomplished so much. And the other is the idea that we have so far to go. We've fallen so short. And so I'll explain what I mean by each. First, this idea that we've come so far. I chose a diverse classroom setting as the picture here. In our community, of course, not every classroom looks like that, not even close. Not every school is that diverse. Some schools certainly are. My oldest of 4 kids is at Kaiser Middle School, and then we'll go up through Grimsley. And in both cases, as a white student, he is a minority. And that's true of every student in those schools. There is no single, I say that just to mean there's no single racial or ethnic group that makes up more than half of the student population. That's unheard of. If you back up 50 years in our history, that would just be unheard of. Part of the reason for that is just a huge increase in diversity as a whole in our population. Immigration was overhauled in the 1960s, and since then, we've had a rapid move towards diversity. So here on the left, this is millions of new immigrants who have come lawfully to the US over the last 50 years and where they came from. On the right, this is our total population. So we were, for the whole country, 83% white in 1970. That's down to 60% white in 2019. Over a relatively short time span, I mean, it's a really dramatic shift in the population. So we are more diverse and inclusive today, I would say. Not only that, on any of a number of measures of progress and well-being, you see these steps forward. So I'll run through all 4 of these. At the top, this is minority representation in Congress. By that, I just mean anybody who does not identify as white. So they could identify as anything else, including Hispanic. That was 4% in 1970, up to 22% today, huge increase. Black basic literacy up from 56% in 1900 to nearly 100%, 99% today. Income, Black average family income from $43,000 50 years ago to $72,000 a couple years ago. And for those who care, yes, this is adjusted for inflation and all of that. And then the one on the bottom is the one that I think is wildest. And this is average life expectancy in the Black population was only 33 years in 1900, and it's up over 70 years today. So just in a number of ways, this is progress, progress, progress. But we can't just have the jelly side. We have to see the whole sandwich. So not only have we come so far, we have so far to go. How could that be if everything I just showed on the last couple slides are true? Well, on a number of different levels. And so let me race through these. On the left, I just grabbed several different statistics that speak to financial standing. And what you see here is just the basic idea that gaps have not closed. So on the top, average family income. On all of these, I'm just showing the white and Black population because back in the older years, that's the only thing that's available. For instance, if you were looking at Hispanic or Latino or Asian, and they wouldn't have the data available in these older years. But average family income going up, gaps not closing. Home ownership rates, gap not closing. Average family wealth, back in the 60s, the average white family had 7 times more. Today, 7 times more. Gap not closing. Look on the right at college completion rates. So this is the percent of adults that have completed 4 years of college. You see all these movements up. You also see gap not closing. Apologies, I know I'm racing through these quickly here. Again, another instance of gap not closing. There's 2 lines on this chart. The top one shows the minority percent of the total population. So this is everyone that does not identify as white and non-Hispanic. The bottom line shows the minority percent of Congress. And this one chart, we could spend 30 minutes on this alone. There's so many stories buried in here. But if we just focus on these recent years, you can see this huge rise, especially over the last 50 years in minority representation. But it hasn't risen any more than the population as a whole. So what do you see? You see that this kind of underrepresentation gap, the gap between minority representation in Congress and minority representation of the whole population, that gap not closing. In criminal justice, I'll just spike out one topic here as it relates to enforcement of drug laws. This shows the deaths from drug overdoses per 100,000 people of each racial group. So don't worry about all the details here. Just big picture idea is that over the last 20 years, the greatest frequency of deaths from drug overdoses has been in the white population. Drug abuse is a real thing and has been a rising thing, but it's been greatest among white people. When you compare that to drug-related imprisonments, you see a vastly different picture. Black and Hispanic way up here, and then white way down here. Something about these two don't connect. We have to admit that. And let me just close with a picture of our city that to me really helps connect past to present. These maps basically shade all the neighborhoods around Greensboro according to what percent of residents in those neighborhoods identify as white. I only have room on this for 2 shading colors, so I just split into white and not white. Apologies for the oversimplification. But you can see in 1970 how strictly segregated our city was. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that we finally changed laws in this country to make it illegal to keep people out of housing based on race alone. That didn't change until the mid-60s. So you see how strictly segregated we were in 1970. What happened from 1970 to 2020? Well, one, our city, like our nation, became much more diverse as a whole. It also became more integrated and more inclusive. You can see this map is not like 1970, but this is not a picture of integration. You know, a picture of an integrated city would be gray everywhere as opposed to white and black. This is still a city that is divided by race. That's us in the present in 2020. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop there. I know I've thrown a lot at you. If anyone's interested in these slides, we can send them out afterwards. And I believe I'm handing it over to you, Winston.
Hello, I'm trying to change my view. There we go, gallery view. I can see Sam. So I was asked by Rhonda and Karen and Ivan to just provide a little grease for the conversation so that we could make the best use of our time with Curtis and Sam and me, and then move into questions from the group. Lots of great people on this call. I scrolled through the participant names. I wish I could see all of your faces. The format doesn't allow for that. But thank you so much for making time to be here and to participate in this conversation now. And as you do, so many of you I know in the community and around your dinner tables and in the workplace and in all kinds of places. So I'm just going to start with a question that we talked about. And Sam, I'm going to ask you to respond first. That Curtis has touched on some pieces of history and how they've informed him. And I guess I'll come back to you in a second, Curtis. But Sam, when you first heard a fuller telling, what I'm going to call a fuller telling of U.S. history, when was that? I mean, for me, it certainly wasn't as a young child, though I grew up in a progressive and in a family that participated in civil rights actions. Both of my parents, my father in particular, in his college days, and even though I grew up in that family, I didn't hear a whole telling of U.S. history until really, I think 7 or 8 years ago. When do you remember, Sam, sort of hearing some of that first wholeness of American history? When was that? What impact did it have on you? Do you remember that?
As far as formal schooling, I feel like I really heard a lot more than I'd heard in the past when I was in law school. Now, that's not to say I didn't have growing awareness before that. I think, for instance, I was in a special program in public school growing up, and it was a magnet program that was at Wiley Elementary. So I knew even then, even though I didn't know history, I knew that my classroom looked a lot different than the other classrooms in the school. In college, I took one of my majors was philosophy, and I had a Black philosophy professor. And you think of philosophers as guys in togas in Greece, and he made sure that part of our education was on the history of African philosophy. Took African American political philosophy, so that was an opportunity to read some of those primary sources who were talking about politics at the time or over the time period that Curtis was talking about. So I learned pieces from each of those things, but a deeper study and a more engagement with the history itself, I would say, in law school for me.
And was that sort of a start of a journey for you to bring you to this place of advocacy and engagement around issues of race and equity and systems and structures, or did that come later or before that?
It came before that. I never understood, for instance, with the school program I was in, okay, I'm getting this class with a different curriculum and fewer students and more field trips, and why are we getting that? Why isn't everyone getting that? I didn't understand until later sort of the fundamental how fundamental race was to what I was experiencing as a disparity, and how that is fundamental to much of the brokenness of our society. So that's the piece that I came to learn later. And I think in part it was because as a white male, I didn't personally have to grapple with a lot of that, but really I became much more involved in law school as I was seeing my classmates. We were all starting to get into the professional world, and I, as a law student, was being treated as though I were already a lawyer, and classmates were being treated as though they were secretaries or workers at the courthouse who were, and I had so much respect and really became very personally angry about the treatment that my friends and colleagues were experiencing. So that stepped it up a lot for me.
Yeah, I think, for me, I was a white child growing up here in Greensboro until I was 10. And there was sort of this sense in the South, my parents grew up in South Carolina, that this racial problem was an old problem that was wrong, but we were making progress on it as a result of civil rights. And we certainly learned about this historical wrong of slavery. I grew up in South Texas for middle school and high school, and we studied Texas history and other things, but it really wasn't until about 8 years ago where these pieces of history that were disparate for me came together in a narrative through the race equity training, when Baylove and Monica and Dina sort of walked through this 400-year history over several hours. And for me, it was like the emperor with no clothes. It's just this watershed kind of moment of, I've been gaslighted, and I didn't even realize I was being gaslighted. I mean, I thought I had an awareness, I thought I understood, and yet I didn't at all, and had spent, a huge part of my professional career working in progressive organizations, doing progressive social justice work. And yet this historical narrative, this deep understanding of how the systems and structures in America are working exactly as they're designed to work. So it was for me, and I'm 54 years old, so that's late in life. I mean, so it was interesting to have the history laid out in such a way, and to be such a powerful motivator and kind of lever for how to communicate and talk about it. And so I think that's why it's so critical that we do teach the fullness of our history in schools, in all of the ways that our history is taught. And I'll say one thing, because Curtis, I want to ask you a question, which was, even after I heard that history, and I'm pretty quick at remembering things and spitting information out again. I've been known to be a good distiller of information, and I couldn't do it. I've sat through the race training like 10 times because it felt like learning a different language. And that everything else in my life had reinforced a particular telling of US history, and had told me that I had even challenged that I was a progressive, I was an advocate. And this fullness of history was really so, it wasn't reinforced anywhere else in my brain, in music, in culture, in art, in the way that I moved through community. So it took a lot of hearing it and seeing it in different ways. And I love the way Curtis presented it today, for me to really internalize it. So that's why I feel like we have to teach it so much younger, so that folks aren't swimming upstream in the way that those of us as grown adults who've been gaslighted for so long have to kind of undo those lessons. But Curtis, I'm curious about what was really the impetus for you, because you definitely learned something at some point that sent you down a rabbit hole, as I've heard you say before, and spend a huge amount of your free time, and now even your professional time, reconstructing personal history, learning about history, looking at data.
Yeah.
But what was the trigger for that for you?
Coming to Greensboro 12 years ago was a big trigger. So I grew up on the white side of a white city in Knoxville, Tennessee, West Knoxville, Tennessee, and Greensboro is very different from my childhood. And I think that really brought me into different circles of discussion and challenged my perspective in new ways. But I will say, and I'll admit this in case anybody else can relate to this that's on the call, I would say my initial response to that was not a healthy one. My initial response was one of being paralyzed. I would say I was paralyzed, it's just not doing anything about it. I would say I was paralyzed by ignorance. And sometimes we kind of blame our old childhood teachers for what they didn't teach us and all that. I have to point back at myself. I mean, I would say it's willful ignorance. At some point, I had to say, Curtis, if you don't know, you don't want to know. So paralyzed by ignorance, and as a guy that is a natural skeptic that likes data but needs to see it himself to kind of have it proven, that did feel paralyzing. I was paralyzed by busyness. It takes time to dig in, and there's other things going on in life. And I was paralyzed by fear, of saying the wrong thing, of engaging in the wrong way, of starting to enter conversations and having some of my biases apparent to other people before they had become apparent to me. I mean, and all of that, I would say, just in an unhealthy way, I stayed out. But really seeing in my church, because of the role that my faith plays, seeing some of the racial division there amongst people that I respect in huge ways, and some people who I began to see would think about some things differently than me, is what probably ultimately made me need to dive in.
Sort of following up on that, Curtis, Sam, what have you found as you've grown in your awareness are the things that causes you to do? And are there some standout experiences for you that were kind of turning points, either, mistakes you made that caused some greater awareness, or something you did that you thought, well, that made a difference. That was a positive thing that I did in response to my understanding about this construct of whiteness, these systems and structures in America that are so imbued with racial inequity. Do you have something you can share along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much I could share, from, very small elements of social skills. I feel like I'm not someone who was naturally gifted with social skills, so I have a lot of rules for myself, and like whatever context I'm in, I assume everyone around me is whatever the maximum status person there could be. If I'm at UNCG, I assume everyone is a professor or a dean or something, unless they tell me otherwise, and so I don't make the mistake that addressing someone as a, some employee that is below their status. I mean, we just had that happen here in Greensboro on the Planning Commission. I'm sure a lot of people saw that, where someone refused to refer to someone as doctor who asked to be referred to by her acquired title of doctor. So I never do things like that. But bigger than that, I came to learn a lot about positionality and privilege, and really grappled with the level of privilege that I have, what that allows me to do, and how I could use it as a tool toward promoting racial equity. It's a big part of why I moved back to Greensboro. I understand, of course I have the positionality of whiteness, maleness, cis, hetero, those things. But also I have a family history, I have social capital, I have financial capital. So I knew that being back here in Greensboro as a young professional, I would be asked to be in positions of leadership or influence, like a member of boards for different organizations, that those positions were largely unearned. Not that I couldn't have screwed up so bad that I didn't get that opportunity, but it was mine to lose. And so I focused on doing that, and having been offered them, then I faced the decision each time, is this something where I can enter into this work and kick the door open for others who have traditionally been excluded? Or is it better that I suggest someone else, someone of a population who's been traditionally excluded? So there, and once you're in there, there are a lot of things you can do. Again, from small kind of moment to moment decisions of a lot of the racial equity discussions that need to happen. Someone has already brought them up. Someone is already saying them within the meetings, and that person is not being listened to. And I'm sure women on the call have had the experience of you speak up, you say something, you raise an issue, and people ignore it until a man says it. Same people of color face the same thing. They'll raise an issue that's a problem. Nobody listens until a white person says it. So not letting comments like that need to be heard pass by without discussion and saying, you know, as my colleague said, what about this? So there are those things. There's creating relationships with either other leaders or members of the staff and saying, you know, what are the real problems here? What do you need a board member's support on? You know, so, I mean, there are a lot of things. I feel like I could talk for way too long and monopolize things. So maybe I'll hand it back to you.
Well, and I think there is so much to say on this topic. And I think I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. We had a few things we thought we would talk about. I'm going to kind of combine them and I'm going to say something and then ask each of you, Curtis, and then Sam. We talked about what it means to be in preparing for this, what it means to lean into discomfort and uncomfortableness and move beyond the paralysis that you talked about, you know, Curtis. We talked about what are the specific things that we've actually done to move forward in our journey or to move organizations forward. I mean, Sam, I love, it's like the cheat sheet of those tactics. I mean, I love the one about just assume maximum stature of everybody you meet. Why not? You know, like what's the harm in that actually, right? In affording someone maybe more respect than they think they deserve or that their position might otherwise. I mean, that's the worst mistake you're going to make when you do that, right? So what harm is there in just assuming maximum stature for every human you meet? And what a change in how that might interrupt our bias, right? When you just say, I'm not going to go with what my gut tells me about how I should interact or what my lizard fast brain tells me. I'm just going to make a decision as a habit to do this every single time I encounter an individual. So I think there's how we have moved on our journey as white people in this learning, how we leaned into the discomfort and beyond paralysis, and then how we use privilege, right, to deconstruct systems that whites created. So like in the introduction, so much of what's happened with race in America is saying we should empathize and help lift up Black people who've been impacted by this thing, instead of focusing on how whites created it through history, how whites have benefited from it unfairly, and then what that means for us in a conversation about building a nation that really does provide equality and opportunity and liberty and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. So I'm going to say, for me, I started out in my journey, it was sort of like, oh my gosh, the emperor of no clothes, I see it everywhere. And I just could see it everywhere. My kids got to jokingly, or teenagers, young teenagers at the time, they would ask any kind of why something is the way it is. And I would say, it's the racial construct. And they just started to joke, you know, it was just like, they'd be like, we know, Mom, it's the racial construct. Like, we're not asking you questions anymore. You know, why don't I understand my math? It's the racial construct. It was just, I saw it everywhere I looked. But then I started using what I typically do to try and make change. So I tried to lead differently, and I was willing to say things other people weren't willing to say, but I've been willing to do that my whole life. I moved into circles of supporting other women, but looking to support women of color, because I had easily supported women in my career, and so I looked to support women of color. But I did these sort of obvious things that matched with what I had done well in the past. Where I find myself today, you know, maybe a decade in, or not quite deeply into this journey, is saying, well, how do I really better understand how I embody whiteness? What is this construct of whiteness? How, in all the institutions that I've led over the years, did we still just tweak white norms to make it a little more palatable for people of color than just questioning these norms altogether? What would happen if we created different kinds of norms when everybody was at the table to create norms? And what have I done in my own life to perpetuate white norms. So critically thinking about how the system has built me and my response. And the other thing I find myself doing now is trying to shift my role to some degree. So lots of people who know me would say, if you're going to use a football metaphor, I've been a quarterback a lot in a lot of organizations and a lot of initiatives. I've been that person. And now I find myself saying, my job is really to be an offensive lineman. I need to block and tackle for leaders who are leading change in this, like what I consider our superintendent and Dina Hayes and others who are on the front lines making decisions, who are knowledgeable, who've studied this for decades and know what it's like to solve these problems. But I need to block and tackle for them because there are white people out there just too addicted to the construct of whiteness and to the systems to be able to allow for change to happen. So it's a different kind of role for me. And then there's a couple of things that I've learned that served me as a woman for 30 years, working in a lot of male-dominated fields, which I did in construction and politics. I raised money in the South. I was often the only woman in the room, often the youngest person in the room. And I had to learn to not give people maximum stature, like to call men by their first names and to level the playing field. So not to use their titles. I had to learn to interrupt them, to be really forceful in my communication. And that served me well. What it doesn't serve me well with is not honoring titles that are hard won by colleagues of color, not interrupting, listening more than talking. And I'm having to practice those things, which are different behaviors from the things that have served me really well the last 20, 30 years. I'm going to be quiet and I might not come back again at all. I'm interested in how you both might speak to that, maybe where you've been in your journey, different approaches at different times. And Curtis, I'm turn it to you.
Yeah, and I'll try to hit it briefly so we have Q&A time. You mentioned at the outset of that, the idea of kind of being willing to move into uncomfortable conversations and stuff. And I would say by nature, that piece is not my challenge. And you maybe could even see that as I went through my first 30 minutes, I kind of prefer to speak in a candid way in discussions. So much so that my wife would tell you, I need to learn to emote my feelings more and stop living out of my head so much. But so that's kind of my nature. But when you come to this conversation in that way and speak candidly, that's hard for a lot of people. And one thing that is a challenge for me is I'm absolutely a people pleaser. I say some things, or maybe I talk about family history in a way that a family member might not want. Don't out yourself, or give a push in an organization that not everybody would want that push. And that's one place of where I am, is in learning to kind of live in and be okay with that discomfort and understand that there will be some tension created. There will be some distance created with some relationships. And that's just kind of life. And to kind of be okay with that and flex with that. And that's against the grain for me. The one other I would speak to is just the idea of staring at all that I have at my disposal, from money to connections to abilities to kind of everything at my disposal, and asking how's that oriented? Is it oriented towards me or others? I grew up in a faith tradition that talked about giving away 10%. Giving away 10% can feel for a while like sacrifice, and then one day you wake up and realize you're 90% focused on yourself, and much of that 10% is given in a way that can come back to you. For instance, given to the church, a good bit of it pays for buildings and sermons that serve my family. So kind of stepping back and asking, how much of my 100% is oriented towards people less fortunate financially, that's another place of where I am.
Sam, anything to add about the spaces of discomfort and where you are in your journey now in terms of tactics, strategies, responses, or reflections versus where you were, say, 5 or 10 years ago?
The piece that comes to mind for me is probably a few years into my legal career, something that was very hard for me. And I learned the lesson, but it was difficult. As I've already said, I have a lot of systems and rules, and I'm a very systems and rules oriented person. And I remember a conversation I was having with another friend of mine who's a lawyer and who's a woman of color. And she was telling me about what had happened to her client and what the judge had done, what the prosecutor had done, these kinds of things. And I was just saying, well, that can't happen. That's not legal. They can't do that. And then having that realization of that can't happen to me.
Right.
That it's not legal, and it will not happen to me because of my position. But there are different systems in place for people of color, and understanding that actually is a component of the system. Whereas, I had thought I had embraced, well, the law can be protective in these kinds of situations. The law only applied if you were a certain type of person. And that was hard for me to understand. It comes back to this, there's an idea called standpoint theory of people who are the subject of oppression have a much more accurate idea of how a country's systems actually work than someone who never sees that half of the system that exists for other people and doesn't exist for me. So that was a point where I really felt ignorant and felt like I had a lot more learning to do.
Yeah, it reminds me, Sam, of an awareness I've come into just the last few years and paying attention to what white people talk about all the time, and what, as I have a growing number of Black colleagues and friends within the school system, and how, like, I never hear them talking about. And I have come to this conclusion. So I'm going to speak to all the white women on the webinar, whoever you are out there, that I, as a white woman, and I see many white women completely addicted to good PR and communications. Like, we are so used to the world of PR and communications speaking our language and speaking directly to us, that the thing that I see white women actually get most angry about is bad communication. That I have all kinds of white women who say to me all the time, well, it's not really the decision so much, it's just how they communicate it that's a problem. And Black people never say that to me, ever. It's sort of like people of color going like, since when did you expect that people were going to communicate with you in some specialized way that you like? Like, all the time I'm having to translate or find or whatever. And yet white women, like, we don't even understand. It's like what is it? One of you say, the fish says to the other fish, how's the water? And the one fish says, what's water? Like, white women are just swimming in all this PR and communication that's being spent to target us, that we don't understand how addicted we are and how everybody doesn't have that experience. And so I think it's being aware of what we don't know. So you're talking about, like, I just don't experience certain things. And unless I believe what people are telling me, I'm never going to open myself up to how policing works or what it means to intersect with the justice system as a white man, the judicial system as a white man versus my, Black female colleague. I am never really going to understand if I don't step outside the world of sort of PR and communication that's just super tailored to me. So how do we become aware of our blind sides as white people, I think, is really important. Somebody talked about self-awareness, I think, in the chat. It's self-awareness, but it's really saying to myself, what am I not seeing? And asking other people, right? Listening to other people's experience and believing them. I think has been eye-opening for me and continues to peel away the sort of layers of the onion for me in this experience of whiteness in America. Curtis, anything for you to add before we go to questions from the?
No, I'll leave it at that.
So I think, Karen, were you going to field questions from the chat? There we go. Please use the Q&A feature if you'd like to ask questions. Are there some already teed up?
Yes, there are. I am getting ready. I'll read a couple. We have some. First question, it says, slavery and inequality have been part of history since the beginning of time. This doesn't make it right, but different generations / races and religions have moved beyond that issue. Why can't we seem to get past this in the United States? That's the first question.
So, and I don't, Curtis is more of the historian. I will say slavery built on conquering peoples over history, wars that led to nations being slaved of other nations, is, as I have learned from historians, a very different kind of social construct and has a different legacy than chattel slavery in the way that African Americans were brought in mass to the US and the way it perpetuated. And the way the whole economic structure of America was built on top of that. And I think and Curtis again may have something to add, if you go back to those numbers that you cited, Curtis, 4 million slaves in America at what, 1860 or something. And I mean, it was like 13% of the population at that time. And it's also 4 million people is like, it's a huge number. It's like the entire states of Delaware, South Dakota, North Dakota, Alaska, and DC, is 4 million people enslaved. And it would be today like having 43 million people enslaved, because we have like 328 million people in America now. So the same ratio would have the entire states of California, Nevada of enslaved peoples. So, I mean, it was such a giant portion of our culture and our economy for so long. And that is why it's so different in the US than in some other historical places where nations were conquered and nations were brought in as enslaved peoples. But Curtis, you might have something else to say about that history.
Well, one, I just want to say I appreciate the question, because that's a question that I found myself asking and not wanting to say out loud, say a decade ago. And so I appreciate somebody saying it out loud. But basically what I was asking is, hey, we're 150 years beyond slavery. Why are we still dealing with this, right? And didn't realize the ignorance in that question at the time. As I dove in and studied, one thing that just struck me is the recency of everything. And so, I mean, we're not talking about slavery. Let's just talk about everything after that. I mean, if you take the first 30 years of the 1900s, there was a period of it from 1901 to 1929 that I looked at. There were 3,000 congressional seats that were filled. You know how many of those went to somebody that was not classified as white? 0. Like, that's how intense these segregating barriers and discrimination was. 0 out of 3,000 over those 30 years. And if you just look at it in families and then kind of practical impact generation to generation, if you go into the 30s, if there was any like money to hand down to inherit from the days of slavery and the Chesney family, if that still lingered in the 1900s, I'm unaware of it. I don't think that my grandfather inherited $1. That said, he grew up in a very wealthy community. And so I have his, pardon me. This is his Boy Scout journal from 1929, the year of the depths of the Great Depression. And I read through it. He wrote every single day without exception. And I don't read stories of struggle. I read stories of childhood play. And it was during the Great Depression that he went to college and finished college and went to med school. That's a privilege. That's an opportunity that others didn't have. Meanwhile, a descendant of Pharaoh, one of the persons that my great-great-grandfather enslaved, so one of his descendants who grew up right around the corner from my grandfather, he only stayed in school through the 4th grade, which was very common. And at that point, he was in the fields working alongside his father 80 hours a week. That's way beyond the standard work week. And he made way less than the minimum wage, because if you're a domestic worker, or if you, let's see, it was domestic workers and agricultural that were minimum wages didn't apply to. So anyways, he and my grandfather and this other person of his same generation, who was descendants of an enslaved man, both went off to World War II, came back to very different lives, one starting a medical practice and one back in the fields. And that's the lives that their kids were born into. Their kids are now with us today, maybe on this call. I mean, you know, that their peers are. I mean, this is today, this is recent. The financial, educational, and otherwise legacies of this stuff are recent and present, and they did not go away that quick without a massive interventions in the scale that we've not attempted.
Thank you, Curtis. I'm going to combine. Oh, I'm sorry, Sam. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly. One, I think that fewer generations, races, or religions have moved beyond this issue than is assumed in the question. I think it's pervasive globally still in many, many nations. So, you know, it's not so easy a thing to just get over. I think we have to reckon with the deep human psychological desire to feel superior, and how much that has impacted us here, and how we continue to reproduce racism for that reason. You know, when we are willing to give up all manner of improvements to our society for the sake of white people feeling psychologically superior. When pools were forced to be integrated, the community pools were closed. When schools were integrated, we began disinvesting from public education. We do not have universal health care like every other developed country, because there is a desire for that inequality, that wanting to be superior. So this is, you know, it is very hard to get over. And to the extent like we've gotten over some racism, like you could look at, well, there used to be more racism against Irish or Italian descendants, those kinds of things. Those groups became white by embracing the oppression of Black people. So, you know, we got over a certain sense of racism by leaning into the very damaging and historical Black-white racist dynamic that we have always had and continue to have.
Thank you, Sam. And that answered the couple questions I was going to combine. You reflected on that. One here says, I appreciate the acknowledgement that there are different systems for white people and people of color / culture. Some would argue that since the system is working as it is designed to work, that there is no use in fixing it. How can white people help advocate for Black and other people of color / culture having their own thriving systems that are not tied to white supremacist systems?
I think that's a great question. And I would shift a bit to say, in truth, the system's working as it's designed and white people are privileged, but I think we also see where the system's cracking, because it's not really working well for anyone. And I would say that we are seeing where white people are not thriving in a way that they do thrive when you create new systems. And there's examples of that. The work that the Greensboro Health Collaborative did it at Moses Cone, specifically looking at lung cancer and these huge disparities between Blacks and white patients. And regardless of the race of the doctor, and 15 years of work that actually eliminated the gap between Black and white patients, and then saw the results for both Black and white patients go up, right? So white people benefited when you closed the gap. Blacks benefited more. Their rates went up because they had a much lower rate, but whites also went up until they came to a sort of equal point in that study. And so I think there are opportunities for us to look at how we do create different systems. I'll give you a small example. I think Robert's Rules of Order is a white construct that was designed to create a way for white men to make certain decisions. It's not a tool that's really useful for integrating diverse perspectives, for facilitating discussion and problem solving. And there are other systems with which groups can use to do that, to engage people in conversation, in solving problems, and in making decisions. And it's not Robert's Rules of Orders. And we could use some of those other facilitation models as our standard operating systems in boardrooms, around staff tables, and in the public square, instead of like trying to stuff something into this construct of an old suit called Robert's Rules of Orders. And so I think there are places where we presumed there are ways that you do things that are just dominant white norms. And we can begin to say, in the environment where I work, what is a dominant white norm? I just thought it was a norm. Actually, it turns out it's a white norm. Is there an alternative structure? How have other systems throughout history solved problems or come together or honored people at the table, and begin to integrate those into our operations?
Thank you, Winston. Thank you. The next question says, you three have done extensive work to become more sensitive to different experiences. What first step or advice will you give your younger 10 years or so self to become aware of the racial construct?
I'll jump in there. I feel like that's a little different for everybody. So let me just speak for myself instead of the person asking the question. For myself, it really was tremendously helpful to read and then read and then read and read some more. And so I would say that, however, I do think I hid behind a book a little, sometimes in an unhealthy way, because in a book, I as opposed to a conversation, I would avoid saying the wrong thing or in the wrong way or whatever. And so I would also say, you know, whatever those questions or feelings or whatever it is that you are kind of holding to yourself because you're not sure how it'll sound, to know you're going to mess up and get it out there and start talking and engaging and kind of learn and get better as you go. But yeah, that's all.
I would just say I had folks who said, oh, you should do this, you should read this, and I thought, I'm too busy and I already know that. There was too much 10 years ago. I thought I knew that I didn't know it all. And I said, I'm doing the work. And then when I stopped, and it's sort of like the difference between charity and justice. I was doing a lot of charity and I needed a lot more education in order to get engaged deeply in the work of justice. And not that charity doesn't matter. People caught in a system that's not working need support. And yet this notion of the last question of we have to commit ourselves to the hard work of changing the system. And so I just didn't make time early enough. I let the work of charity distract me from the deep work of learning systems and justice for too long. And I would step into that work faster.
For me, I would say I would have embraced, I mean, it, as Curtis brought up, it is difficult to really face down your privilege. And I think some of us who were born with a lot of privilege and come to realize the unfairness of these systems and our unearned advantages, there is a desire to just throw it all away, give it up, you know, like with my family history, to go somewhere else where I can be anonymous and not have to worry about privilege in that way. But now I think it is our responsibility, and you know, certainly those of us on the call who are white have a high degree of privilege, some of us more than others. You know, I have gender and wealth and these other things in addition to whiteness. But you have to recognize the power that you have in spaces to push for things that people of color do not have the freedom to do. There is a level of strategizing that people of color have to engage in every day about what unfairness they will or won't challenge, when they'll raise their voice. Is it worth the personal or professional risk to take this, you know, to take on this battle on this day? I have so much more freedom to take on those battles, and giving up the privilege because it feels kind of psychologically comforting to say, that doesn't matter so much because I'm in a different place where I don't have to think about it. You need to think about it. You need to embrace it, and you need to use it for justice.
Thank you, Sam. Really quick, you all, this last question, if you could take maybe a few seconds to maybe throw out a few words. But the question is, what would you recommend for attendees as the next best action, something tangible to do?
I would say Google white dominant culture or white supremacy culture, because it's sort of one of the, I mean, we learn about history and we learn about social justice and we learn about listening, but it starts to get into sort of explaining how the system works to just coddle white people, how it all works around a white construct. And it starts to have you, I think, begin to look at how you communicate, how your organizations run, how you move in the world in a way that we thought was just a norm or an American norm, turns out is a white norm. And when we do that, we can start to think about what other systems might look like and how you might build an America that's fueled and held up by other systems and not just white dominant or white supremacy systems.
Thanks, Winston. Curtis?
Sam, you want to jump in first? I'm thinking.
Sure.
We have like half a minute to do this.
All right.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry to rush.
you know, one is listen to Black voices. Don't take up a lot of time of all the people expecting them to educate you, but there are voices on Twitter or other places that you can listen to and learn a lot that way. And ask questions in your social group, ask questions in your boardrooms, in your volunteer positions. What are we doing about racial equity? You need to be having those conversations. Bring them up, start making it a point of conversation. White people are not educated because no one expects them to be educated. If you expect your friends and social group to be educated and to be able to answer that question, that starts to shift norms.
Thank you, Sam.
I've decided I don't know how to answer that question well in 15 seconds, but I'd love to do it in 30 minutes. So whoever asked it, my full name @gmail.com. Just send me an email. I'd love to have a coffee.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we'll switch over to Lynn to close us out.
Well, that was insightful. That was honest. That was raw in some spots, but I want to thank our panelists, Curtis Chesney, Winston McGregor, and Sam Cohn for being open, honest, and sharing tools about this journey to dismantle, break down the matrix. I kept feeling like we were in the matrix, going to break down the system, waiting for who's going to be Neo. The matrix of white supremacy and systemic racism. And I want to thank to our sponsors for making Beyond the 846 series accessible and free to the community. And I want you to know that your feedback is helpful to us so we can continue to bring these seminars, these webinars to the forefront. Please do complete the survey, which will be emailed to you directly. This has been marvelous today. And we want you to join us Wednesday, May 26th, for operationalizing racial equity in your organization with Erica Hines. She's a principal with every level leadership. On behalf of NCCJ of the Piedmont Triad and the YMCA of Greensboro, thank you for spending the time with us today. Peace.
Thank you.